Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this exclusive webinar on strengthening your security posture for hybrid cloud scenarios. My name is Marcus Abdullah with Vigilant Technologies, and I will be your host for today's presentation. We'll soon be joined by our speaker for today's presentation, technology strategist Stephen Clark. Today we'll look at a live environment review of the Azure Security Center, automated discovery of potential threats and workloads. We'll look at auto-remediation of threats, enforcing protection policies for workload and users, and then we'll open up the floor for some Q&A. Before we begin, let's go over just a few housekeeping notes. If you have any questions, whether technical or related to today's topic, please submit them using the Q&A box on your screen. We will have the full recording of today's presentation available to all attendees so you can view it later or share it with your colleagues. Let's get started today with a very brief description on who Vigilant Technologies is. Vigilant is a boutique global consultancy delivering advisory implementation and managed services for over 20 years. Vigilant Technologies represents a wide variety of technologies with a great range of capabilities from your traditional IT, which would be infrastructure, business apps, middleware, and analytics, onto what we call the technologies in this digital transformation era, more specifically intelligent automation. We've been in business for over 20 years as noted, and along the way we've been involved in over 75 cloud implementations worldwide. We work workloads from on-prem onto these cloud shapes, tune them, optimize them, and support them. We have a lot of referenceable examples and great successes that we can share. Also along the way, we've been involved in over 150 enterprise application projects, including your traditional on-prem, EBS, and other apps where we've helped with upgrades, spinning up new environments, new instances, and new localizations. Finally, let's take a brief look on our Microsoft capabilities. We are now a one-stop shop for your Microsoft solution needs, including engineering services for Azure, including workload migrations and managed services, Office 365 and modern workplace deployments, including assessments, optimizations, custom-built Azure, SharePoint, App Dev, and DevOps solutions, and the modernization of legacy .NET and SharePoint workloads, along with delivery and configuration of Microsoft Power Apps, Forms, and BI, in addition to on-premise and cloud-based upgrades, migrations, managed services, integrations with AWS, OCI, and Azure. With that being said, I am excited today to introduce Stephen Clark. Stephen is Vigilant's technology strategist with over 20 years of experience designing enterprise solutions for customers with a special focus on creating economies of scale, simplification of application integrations to reduce costs, and ultimately ensure that identity and security to all project phases. Stephen, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Marcus. Team, I am really excited to get to spend some time with you today to talk about how the Microsoft stack, specifically Azure Security Center, can help you strengthen your security posture for hybrid cloud scenarios. Now, keep in mind that during our presentation today, that hybrid cloud is not the only scenario that Azure Security Center can provide visibility into. If you're cloud native, Azure Security Center will obviously be part of your security strategy and how you posture your InfoSec cybersecurity programs. Now, just for a quick overview of Azure Security Center, this tool is really an end-to-end mechanism for your team to help drive policy and compliance from a regulatory audit perspective. If you have things like PCI, ISO, HIPAA, or NIST level compliancy, Azure Security Center will basically integrate into your workloads on-premise, workloads in the cloud, and provide you visibility as to how well your InfoSec cybersecurity programs are working. Part of the value prop is that with this policy and compliance integration, if you have specific general controls, as an example, PCI DSS 3.2 general controls, or if you're being audited by Deloitte or Protiviti, and you have an ISO certification, Azure Security Center can actually evaluate your workloads, determine where you fall short of that compliance, and offer remediation as a go-forward basis. And all of this is accomplished 24/7/365. Now, beyond policy and compliance, if you are interested in what is referred to as resource security hygiene, Azure Security Center is definitely the tool that can provide enormous value to your organization. Resource security hygiene, basically in a nutshell, is the following. If you have virtualized workloads, platform as a service workloads, SaaS-based workloads, or custom car solutions that you have developed in-house, the resource security hygiene mechanism will actually go out, evaluate the infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service based workloads, and identify gaps in your infrastructure design. So if you have, for example, things like the Azure firewall that's been deployed, and you've accidentally opened up a specific port to allow RDP session connectivity from a public IP space, the resource security hygiene mechanism will alert you to that gap in your security infrastructure design. Now, this is a critically important aspect of a security center. As human beings, we all make mistakes. And so as you begin to execute upon your policy and compliance capabilities, and you know that from a resource security hygiene perspective, you need a digital twin or you need a second set of eyes watching your environment 24/7 by 365 for human mistakes and or threats coming in from the outside world, the Security Center will dashboard all of your environment parameters in a single pane of glass. Additionally, Azure Security Center is very good at identifying the types of threats that you're being subjected to. Now, one of the value props of Azure Security Center is that Microsoft has actually classified threats in 3 buckets: high severity, medium severity, and low severity. All the telemetry associated with cloud-based workloads are gathered into an IoT-like engine, evaluated with AI and machine learning, and then will notify you via workflows, which may, by the way, also tie into things like Microsoft Power Apps, Microsoft Flow, to notify you in Teams. And as an example, if you had an exposed VM and RDP sessions were coming from offshore and your localized accounts were attempted to be utilized for that RDP session, as a simple example, this threat protection mechanism would classify that as a high severity threat. And with some simple configuration of Azure Security Center, your team would be immediately notified in Microsoft Teams. That notification could be sent to a specific channel. And now, not only has Security Center made note of the threat, but the threat has been remediated, and your organization now has the visibility from a single pane of glass of the misconfiguration of that RDP port restriction. So in essence, this is your second set of eyes, your digital assistant for policy and compliance, resource security hygiene, and again, reviewing your infrastructure, platform as a service, and software as a service-based capabilities in the overall design, and also additionally providing you threat protection across the entire Microsoft Azure ecosystem and including modern workplace and Office 365. Now, a couple of points about the Azure Security Center. One of the value-added elements of Azure Security Center is the Secure Score dashboard. The Secure Score dashboard is your single pane of glass for how are we doing in regards to the configuration of our overall on-premise and cloud-based solution sets. So if you have, for example, do we have updates applied to all of our VMs? Do we have our storage accounts encrypted at rest? And more importantly, how many members of our team have global admin privilege or the ability to turn down resources? All of the fundamental elements of system level access, application level access, networking, encryption, and simple things like key vault settings are all evaluated. And this type of evaluation, again, can be tied to VMware workloads on premise, VMware workload in the cloud, and you can also install agents to AWS workloads. So that way, Azure Security Center can evaluate your infrastructure from end to end. The value of this is that you have a single pane of glass for all threats, event logging, and telemetry that's being gathered. All of that telemetry is evaluated for relevancy, and thus in turn, you're not held responsible for necessarily human mistakes. Last but not least, a mechanism within Azure Security Center that is being taken advantage of on a day-to-day basis is something called just-in-time access. Now, we all know that as you begin to stand up VMs, and sometimes organizations will have hundreds, if not thousands of VMs, it's critically important to have the capability of dictating who can access those VMs but more importantly, when and for how long. Security Center with the Microsoft Azure platform has integrated into what's called the JIT, or just-in-time VM access control mechanism. So if you have 5 systems administrators, systems engineers, or a CISO that would like to have visibility into who's accessing VMs, let's say from an RDP perspective, you have a complete reporting mechanism that allows for your team to gain visibility into how many VMs did Stephen access today and for how long. And again, if you did decide to say, Stephen only needs access to this series of VMs for 2 hours on a Saturday morning to apply a security fix patch update, you actually define that Stephen will have JIT access to that VM between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. And after that time has elapsed, Stephen no longer has access to that VM. The value prop of this is that now you have a wonderful change control mechanism from a security-based perspective. Last but not least, I've already touched upon the recommendations aspect of Security Center. Azure Security Center actually evaluates your workloads for configuration best practices. Things like just-in-time network access, just-in-time VM access, or something as simple as you have the following ports opened up on this VM. Those ports are not being utilized, and as a result, should be shut down in terms of its ability to send out a request through port A or port 3389 from a load balancing perspective. Least privileged approach is always the recommended best practice by Microsoft. And this tool gives you that approach without having to have all the technical knowledge to make it happen. And as you begin to explore these recommendations, Microsoft will walk you through from end to end, how do you go about implementing those changes? And more than often than not, you will see something that is referred to as a quick fix. By utilizing the quick fix, it's point, click, and shoot in nature, and your team can go about its normal routine and not waste a lot of time trying to decide, how do we solve this problem? Now, in addition to security, the Security Center actually takes a health-based approach to VMs as well. Now, by health, what Security Center will provide to you is you have the following VMs that have not been properly optimized from a security perspective. And as a result, Azure Security Center will view these resources as unhealthy, thereby eliminating the need for you to spend a lot of time providing an inventory or asset perspective of what resources you've stood up and to evaluate them one at a time. And again, going back to that digital assistant concept, you can work with Vigilant technologies and we can define the policies and the approaches to optimize your infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or software as a service-based solution sets. And again, saving you time, energy, and money, and the opportunity to make mistakes due to a lack of visibility into what's happening in your environment. Now, a couple of points in regards to Azure Security Center, and then I will jump into a live environment. I want to quickly cover the recommendation settings of Security Center. Azure Security Center will walk you through step-by-step, recommendation by recommendation to identify resources that have been failed to be optimized from a security perspective. Now, more importantly, you have the ability to export out these recommendations, provide that to your change advisory board for approval, and then actually implement the recommendations from a quick fix perspective. Microsoft walks you through, for example, how do you configure a function app that needs to be accessible over secure HTTP? Or how many VMs do I have that have not had the proper system updates, firmware, or driver updates for systems that are on premise that need to be remediated from a fixed patch management perspective? And will actually give you the count of resources that these particular quick fixes need to be applied to. So if you have 100 VMs, and in this case, there are 18 VMs that need to have fixed patch management considerations reviewed, and that will score that particular severity for you. Again, end to end, and whether it's an application development-based resource, such as Azure DevOps, and you have a storage account associated with that Azure DevOps environment, or a diagnostic log for event logging, or a traditional infrastructure as a service resource, such as a VM that does not have disk encryption turned on, Azure Security Center will evaluate, again, all components and solution sets supported by the Microsoft ecosystem. Now, one last aspect I want to touch upon, which Vigilant Technologies can help you drive forward, and that is the integration of the Cloud App Security Model or Cloud App Security Portal with the use of the Azure Security Center. Now, this particular portal and capability has tremendous value if you have non-Microsoft ecosystem solutions. An example of this might be Box, SAP, Amazon Web Services. It could be Exchange on-premise. It could be Atlassian, Jira, Confluence. A lot of these solution sets are SaaS or a mix of on-premise and SaaS-based solutioning. The key is that you have a one-stop shop for the visibility of those solutions, to understand the ingress and egress traffic subjected against those particular solution sets, and more importantly, the ability to weigh risk. With this risk-based mechanism, you can actually drill down into the dashboards to gain insights into, do we have potential threats coming on to this resource from offshore? Or do we have a threat inside of our four walls? Perhaps it's a VM that's been exploited and is taking advantage of the ability to authenticate to a storage repository in Box. And that particular Box repository has all of your legal or payroll information stored in that solution set. You would want to know, where's the traffic coming from? The Cloud App Security Model or the Cloud Discovery Toolboard and Dashboard will give you that visibility, identify the user accounts, the IP addresses, and more importantly, the apps that have been discovered to actually be causing the problem. And again, if you already have a third-party SIEM solution, such as IBM QRadar, we can actually help you configure the telemetry ingestion from IBM QRadar and feed that directly into Azure Security Center. And again, to take the data, summarize it, provide you visibility from a dashboard perspective, and thereby reduce the complexity of data interpretation. So with that, I'm going to pause our screen share, and I'm going to jump right into the Azure Security Center, and I will restart the screen share at that time. So what you're looking at now is a live environment for Azure Security Center. Now keep in mind that this environment is a labs-based environment. There's nothing specific about a customer, nor is this representative of a production workload. But what I wanted to illustrate was the capability for Azure Security Center to actually show you some of the secure score, regulatory audit compliance capabilities that you will see and benefit from by adopting the Vigilant Technologies approach. Now, some of the good news in regard to Azure Security Center is this, is that by running it simply for the workloads that you have on premise and on the cloud, you can compare how are we doing on premise, how are we doing in Microsoft Azure, or how are the resources stood up in AWS, for example, Linux and Windows Server OS VMs, are they configured and optimized based upon Microsoft best practices? Now let's say hypothetically that I have a PCI, ISO, or SOC 1 or SOC 2 regulatory compliance. How am I being benchmarked? Let me click here and pull up the benchmarking regulatory compliance portal. Now what you'll see in my demo environment is that I have passed 21 of 37 controls. And this is incredibly powerful because number one, not only does this tell me where the gaps are, but it will identify which controls need work. So if I, for example, expand all compliance controls that I'm subjected to, it will notify me where I need to spend time. So for example, I'm going to take a look here at the first general control for implementing security for internal traffic. As you can see, I'm definitely in the red. My firewalls have not been optimized. The ports on my virtual machines have not been optimized for access, and perhaps they should be turned off. Additionally, I do not have adaptive networking recommendations for Microsoft turned on for internet-facing virtual machines. So without having to have the intrinsic subject matter expertise of ISO or PCI or SOC, I now have a subject matter expert, a digital twin, who has the visibility into my resources, is making recommendations on a 24/7/365 basis, and then allows for your organization to take that to a change advisory board or to make instantaneous decisions on how to resolve that regulatory compliance status. Now, I'm going to jump right into this specific recommendation. Now, this specific recommendation is for storage accounts, and it will actually identify the resources that are unhealthy. So if I click here on this specific resource, it's going to jump right into how did I configure the storage repository for Azure Sentinel. Azure Sentinel is a scene-based solution set. So imagine misconfiguring your scene level solution set that's gathering the data and the telemetry for your logging and event dashboarding from a SIEM-based solution. So now my scene-based solution could be potentially compromised. And that would be, from a regulatory audit perspective, definitely a score of 0 or a grade of F, because your security solution itself is not actually configured properly. Now let me go back to the regulatory compliance dashboard again. Let's take a look at this particular notification of the fact that my private network access to Azure services is not optimized as well. Let's click here for the specific item noted from an Azure Key Vault perspective. Now here, my Key Vault has not been configured to utilize what's called a private endpoint. It identifies the resource and will actually make recommendations for that misconfiguration. So again, it's all about giving you visibility into what's happening, which resources are impacted, and how you can best configure those resources from a security, regulatory audit perspective, but more importantly, take remediation and notifications to the next level, meaning that your team can be notified of high-level events, mid-level events, unhealthy events, or if you have a systems administrator who is logged in with just-in-time control, you will be notified with some basic configuration of which systems administrators are actually attempting to utilize an RDP port for a series of VMs. That way, you always know what is happening, when it's happening, and what the potential impacts may be. Now let's jump right into one other component that I think you'll find interesting, and that is security alerts. Now, security alerts are only as good as the effectiveness of the alert itself and your response plan. The good news about Security Center is that this can actually be a very opportunistic time for your organization to streamline how you get alerts, how you process alerts, and even take a look at integrating those alerts with things like ServiceNow or your service desk solution. If we go back in time, when the Target Corporation had been hacked, the failure wasn't that they didn't have the proper tooling, but the failure was that they had so many alerts that their team began to ignore those alerts. So with this tool, you can define all high-level events for this series of VMs will go to this team. All medium-level events for VMs will go to Team B, and anything that has a security severity of low and that has been auto-remediated and is not a concern, it can go into the bit bucket. You can apply a data retention policy to those alerts and thereby allow them to drop off and reduce your overall consumption. So as you can see, not only is the Azure Security Center a security tool, a compliance tool, a threat remediation capability, but it keeps your consumption low based upon how long you would like to keep those events alive. And again, highly valuable solution set to help you retire on-premise solutions, to integrate your on-prem, your colo, your data center approaches for threat ingestion, threat remediation, as well as dashboarding. Now, for some of you, you may be asking yourself, well, what about third-party AV solutions? Things like Sophos, Symantec Endpoint Overprotection, and McAfee. Or let's say that you have Defender. The good news is that for the most part, The primary mainstream providers all have integration and hooks into Azure Security Center. And this can be accomplished by simply ensuring that you have an understanding of where's the data residing, how do you want to collect the telemetry, how would you like to classify the telemetry, and then sit back and watch Azure Security Center do the rest of the work. More importantly, all dashboard elements are reflective of what's happening in your environment in real time. And again, part of the value prop of the Azure platform is that it's not static. Everything is dynamic, security solutions are integrated, and you can go home and rest at night knowing that your digital twin, your virtual CISO, has an eye on the sky for all resources that have been deployed in Azure, in AWS, or in VMware on-premise. Again, letting you configure, optimize, take recommendations, deploy those recommendations, and remain in compliance. Now, before we close out our demo today, I want to talk a little bit about workflow automation. Now, automation in the cloud is key. As we all know, Azure DevOps or the DevOps community, the value of this solution is, number one, by standardizing workflow automations, you have the capability of saying, if I have an event that's triggered in the following way, I want for you to perform the following steps. And a good example of this may be, I have a VM, an RDP port has been utilized. Stephen, as a systems administrator, had JIT access. However, I still want to be notified in Teams when Stephen logged on to the VM with RDP, when he logged out, and when his work has been completed. So by simply adding a workflow automation, which you can be very creative in these workflow automations, and let me give this a name. I will call this Workflow 1. I will pick a particular resource group, and then I will define if a threat detection alert is actually noted from a telemetry perspective. And let's say that the alert name contains something like RDP. I will say anything that is collected by Azure Security Center with an alert associated with RDP, for all severities, we will do the following or take the following actions. And again, you can utilize pre-existing logic apps that your application developers have designed and written themselves, or, which is a really awesome value add from an Azure Security Center perspective, Microsoft will actually provide logic apps to you. For more information, I would love to spend some additional time with you in another session to discuss how Vigilant technologies can help you utilize logic apps. But if you're already very familiar with logic apps in the design of those solution sets, you can actually borrow from pre-developed solutions in places like Git. And the Vigilant Technologies team can help you deploy those logic apps, customize those logic apps to include workflow solutions into Teams, data collection within Azure Security Center, and then giving you the ability to even do really cool things like take those alerts and have them sent over to solution sets like ServiceNow. Now, the value prop of that is if you have a high-level workflow automation take place and it's a high-level threat on a particular VM, if that's your trigger condition, ServiceNow, as an example, could be notified. And when that ServiceNow ticket is created, a ticket's created and sent to the appropriate resource. Now, you've actually eliminated the need to log into Azure Security Center, look at the logs, and only to find out that there's not a problem. But if there is an issue, this particular workflow automation tool gives you the ability to automate the notification mechanism, create the ticket in your third-party help desk-based solution, and get it assigned to the right person in real time to ensure that their time is best utilized. Now, team, this is where I'm going to pull back a little bit. And again, super appreciate your time in regards to giving the Vigilant Technologies team the opportunity to discuss Azure Security Center. I know that many of you may have questions. There may be even call to action items from your team, from those that have joined in regards to how can Vigilant Technologies help you get started. Marcus, Nick, and myself, or the entire Vigilant Technologies team can definitely schedule time with you on a one-on-one basis in terms of how do you get started, what is the best practices for Azure Security Center, And whom on the Vigilant Technologies systems engineering team can we have that's on our bench of expertise across the globe deploy Azure Security Center in the best way possible? With that being said, I would like to open up some time. And Marcus, I will
Yep.
pass the ball to you.
Awesome,
Again,
Stephen.
thank you for your time.
Thank you, Stephen. Very informative. Getting some very good feedback from the audience here as well. Just a couple of friendly reminders. If you do any questions related to Stephen's presentation today, please submit them using the Q&A box on your screen. We do have a few in already, but still time to submit yours. Another reminder, we will have the recorded version of Stephen's presentation available for a replay at the conclusion of today's talk. So we will send that link out to everyone after this presentation. One more step before we get to the Q&A, I do want to share a special takeaway for our attendees today. For attending, you all have qualified for a free security assessment of Modern Workplace. Vigilant will provide a review and discovery of Office 365 configuration and provide best practices identifying gaps in the data, information protection, and compliance, and help drive a path forward for best practices of Teams deployment for mobile devices, and finally provide a report of all the findings from the assessment. I will be in touch with all attendees at the conclusion of today's presentation, but you can also contact me today to speak further on this offer. With that being said, let's get right into some of the questions. Stephen, we do have a few in already. Let's get right to them. First one, what are the dependencies to deploy the Microsoft Secure Score?
That is a great question. First and foremost, the Secure Score solution set is part of the Microsoft Cloud App Security model, and of course, the Modern Workplace E3 licensing SKU. Now, there are add-on licensing SKUs that we can help you take advantage of, but at the end of the day, once you have purchased one SKU, you can then integrate Azure Security Center with the Secure Score or Compliance Center capability. Additionally, we can help you run through a demo of these solution sets and even build out a sandbox environment for you to determine, is this the right way to go? Things like Microsoft Intune or Endpoint Configuration Manager that is actually part of the integration with Security Center, the cloud security model. You can actually utilize these types of resources for free for 30 days. And again, Marcus, I'd be happy to spend time with anyone that's been on the call today to talk about how to get started, and they can contact me directly and we can get the ball rolling.
Excellent. Thanks, Stephen. Next one. For audit and compliance, what are the options for Azure and Office 365 or Modern Workplace?
Another good question. So due to the fact that Microsoft Azure, Office 365, and Modern Workplace are actually one integrated platform, any compliance security offering that you can think of, again, whether it's NIST, PCI, ISO, SOC 1, SOC 2, GDPR, and so forth, you can actually approach this from the cloud app security model as well. And that licensing SKU follows the same form and function. One important aspect of this is once you have purchased the appropriate SKU for the cloud app security model and you hook it into the Azure Security Center, which by the way is point, click, and shoot, we can help define best practices for the interpretation, the building out of dashboards, and again, give you that SOC and NOC-like capability from a SaaS-based solution set. And always know, where do I fall short in regards to security and compliance?
Excellent, thank you. Does Azure AD basically fully support all aspects of the Azure Cloud App Security model?
That's another good question. Azure AD at its core is the identity platform for the Microsoft Azure ecosystem. As long as you have Azure Security, Azure Security Center Free Edition or the next tier edition enabled, and you have Azure AD Basic, which Azure AD Basic is free with Office 365 to get started, you can already take advantage of Azure Security Center. Now, if you do have enhanced requirements for things like single sign-on, MFA, you want a single sign-on portal, for example, for all of your on-premise and cloud-based ecosystem solution sets, we can bump you up to Azure AD P1. And with Azure AD P1, now you have an enhanced capability with the Azure Security Center from a public-facing perspective. So if you have non-domain joined machines, or if you're working with third-party providers that you want to take advantage of their email addresses versus giving them a domain level address, Well, that Azure AD capability extends out to Azure Security Center, and you would be able to determine, did John and Susan from legalteama.com access the VM that I gave to them? Or how did they use the content in Teams? Again, the whole value prop of that, Marcus, is that regardless of whether it's an Office 365 or Modern Workplace or Azure-based resource, all the telemetry feeds into Azure Security Center. The Cloud App Security model will weigh and score the vulnerabilities. And then if you simply want something as simple as a report of, what are my users doing when they sign into Azure AD? All that's pre-built in and pre-baked in. There is no need to develop a report or a dashboard. It's just part of the ecosystem out of the box.
Thank you. All right, we've got an attendee who wants to challenge you with an AWS question. So can you tell us a bit more about agent installations in AWS? Is it specific to VMs, or can agents evaluate containers as well?
That is a wonderful question. So with containerization, and I'm going to make the assumption that it's more than likely a standardized Docker container. So if you have, for example, a containerized workload, and I'll give a very simple example, but let's say that you have a containerized workload for a legacy-based solution set that was running on premise, and you've managed to get the resource up and running in Docker, and then you say, you know what, now we want to take advantage of the telemetry, the security logging, and the events that are being placed up against the Docker container, as well as the events that are being placed upon the workloads that have been contained within the Docker container, and including all the networking configuration and monitoring that are part of Docker? The answer is yes. So for example, if you have an AWS solution set and you're using the AWS IAM solution sets for identity, well, AWS and Microsoft have the hooks automatically developed that will allow you to do the following. I sign into Azure AD. I use SSO integration to the AWS IAM platform. I naturally authenticate through Azure AD SSO to that particular resource that's been containerized. And now, from a systems administrative perspective, I have one version of the truth for Stephen's identity, what resources he accessed, when was this Docker container utilized from a resource workload perspective. If I have 5 nodes that are dedicated to this specific Docker container, then I know, for example, things like, what was the utilization of the Docker container? And this is, again, a separate topic, but it also speaks to the logging and telemetry capabilities of the Azure ecosystem. So you can monitor the security, the utilization of the Docker container, how the VM or the resource inside the container is utilized, when it authenticated for that user, and again, not have to worry about depending upon another cloud solution dashboard. Again, part of that end-to-end perspective of the single version of truth.
Excellent. We'll wrap it up here at this last question. How does Azure Bastion and Azure ARC, recently added services, integrate with the Microsoft Cloud App Security model?
Wonderful question. So a little bit of background. Azure Arc and Azure Bastion were meant to solve fundamental problems of organizations looking to have, number one single version of the truth from I have 500 VMs, and I want to have a management plane for all those VMs, whether they're VMs in Azure, VMs on premise, VMs in AWS, or VMs in GCP. And that's Azure Arc in a nutshell. Marcus, we can actually provide demos of Azure Arc at a later time. And so for anyone in the audience that wants to know about Azure Arc integration with Azure Security Center, happy to address that. But the good news is that anything that the Azure Arc solution set is doing, Azure Security Center is garnering and ingesting all those events. So if you have 2 or 3 systems administrators making changes to Azure Arc, well, guess what? All of those events are captured. And those specific systems administrators, when configured correctly, cannot backtrack or remove the audit logs and the activity that they've incurred. Now for Azure Bastion, this is a really, I think, important point as well for Azure Security Center. Azure Bastion, in a nutshell, was meant to help you replace the traditional concepts of the jump box. Microsoft has provided a template and best practice deployment guide for Azure Bastion. So that way, if you do need to administrate your Azure-based resources, for example, from a coffee shop on a Lenovo ThinkPad system, and you know that no matter what you do, you will be on unsecured public Wi-Fi or unsecured internet, that you are accessing those systems from a secured Azure Bastion session. And essentially, Azure Bastion is replacing the DMZ jump box concept. Well, how does that hook into Azure Security Center? It's automatic. When you deploy Azure Bastion, you have the capability to determine where do the event logs go to, how long are those event logs kept, and then you'll see as Azure Bastion is actually utilized to manage the resources in Azure, Azure Security Center will make a note of that. And if anyone does make a slight configuration tweak to Azure Bastion or Azure Arc, it will classify that change as healthy, unhealthy, or very, very high risk. And with the workflow that we just discussed today, you can actually be notified in real time of, we've had an incorrect configuration of Azure Bastion or Azure Arc applied to our environment, and then go back and very quickly auto-remediate the challenge.
Thanks, Stephen. That is all the time we have left for questions. A lot of good ones there. Appreciate everyone taking the time to listen in and pose some of your questions. So if your question was unanswered, do apologize, but we will respond to you via email with an answer. I want to also take a quick minute to thank everyone for joining us. You can find my information on the slide shown here. I will be sure to follow up with everyone with a replay link and also to see if there's ways that we could help you with your Azure and your security model. But please feel free to reach out today to discuss your operations and how Vigilant can help you secure your hybrid environment. Thank you all and have a great day.